Hey fearsome friends, from night-prowling kidnappers, demons, being preyed on whilst camping, here are 12 scary stories to lull you to sleep. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. This just happened last night. My boyfriend, our husky, and I embarked upon our long holiday road trip to see our families earlier today. 14 hours of this trip takes place on a major US interstate highway, and we were looking for places to make our last gas stop and found a place just off the highway. We pulled off and into the desolate gas station, and immediately were greeted by a fairly large, somewhat sketchy man taking not so subtle glances in our direction. We both joked that maybe we'd chosen the wrong gas station, and boy were we right. My boyfriend suggested that while he pumped the gas and run to the restroom, I take our dog and let him stretch his legs. Being a city girl, I know to always carry my Mason phone, especially at night, and as I started to make my way towards the ill-lit side of the gas station, and my boyfriend to the restroom, I made it not 30 feet from my car and was approached by a small, Chihuahua cross mutt with a collar, who happily greeted our husky. I looked around for an owner, whilst the two dogs got to know one another, and continued to walk to a patch of grass with our new follower in tow. My first instinct was to help the dog, and find his owner, but in the back of my mind something felt very off, and to be honest it had felt off since the moment we'd pulled in. I immediately called my boyfriend and told him I had found a dog, but something felt weird. He immediately abandoned his bathroom break and came out to meet me, while I was standing with our dog and the dog, who came seemingly out of nowhere. I felt eyes on me from the employees working outside. My boyfriend expressed concern about the dog being loose so close to a major highway, and further looked around for its possible owner. He approached one of the employees who had been changing out trash liners right next to our car for some time now, and asked him if he had any idea whose dog it was. Then in perfect English he replied, "I don't speak English," and anxiously turned around to continue to go through the motions of changing out a trash liner he had been standing at this whole time. He then continued to watch us chase around this dog, until the dog led us behind the store and gas station. With my boyfriend 5 feet behind me, I followed the dog to the back of the store, where I came across 10 or so big trucks that were sat largely in darkness and were resting for the night. Cardboard boxes and broken wood pallets covered the dirt, and a large man in a gas station uniform greeted me, staring through a glass door. With my boyfriend out of view, I bent down to check the dog's tag as the man continued to stare. My boyfriend then approached, and that's when the man behind the glass door's demeanor changed. Almost dejectedly, he opened the glass door, so I quickly asked, "Do you know whose dog this is?" He nervously fumbled his words and replied, "Yeah, that's my dog." We both exhaled and exchanged a look as if to say, something about that was really weird. We then made our way back to the car, and my boyfriend remembered he had to still use the bathroom, so I settled back into our locked car. When my boyfriend came back, he told me the same man we'd talked to at the back of the store had followed him to the bathroom and stood behind him and watched. That's when we realized just how creepy and surreal the last 15 minutes had been. As we drove away, we discussed the strange and creepy series of events, and how the whole thing felt staged or set up. Why did the employee act like he didn't know the dog when it belonged to his co-worker? We immediately Googled the small town we had stopped in, and discovered it had been a hot spot for human trafficking, and in recent months, 60 people had been arrested. Was this just a string of eerie coincidences, or was there something more sinister going on here? So this just happened less than an hour ago in front of my house, and I've been staring at my computer confused ever since. Sharing here to talk about it seems like a good outlet to get it off my mind at least, so I'll keep it as short as I can. I just need to tell someone. I was at my computer, and my dog started nudging my elbow, which is his signal that he needs to go outside. So I got up, put on my shoes and coat, got him on the leash, and moved to the front door to take him out into the front yard. Taking him out there isn't something I usually do, but my shoes and coat were right by the door, so I figured, why not? We'll go out the front tonight. However, as soon as I opened my door, I saw there was a person crossing my driveway. It was dark, but they were lit up by my lamppost, and they saw me exiting my house. They stopped dead in their tracks. I did not expect this, so I stopped dead in mine too, and we proceeded to have a staring contest for a bit. Although I'm not 100% sure, as I'm really blind without my glasses, and couldn't actually see if this person was making eye contact with me or where they were looking. But thankfully after time, they kept walking. All right, I thought. The dog still needed to pee, so we're not going back inside just yet. He's a large German Shepherd mix at least, so I'm not too afraid of anyone attacking me, as they would have to deal with him first. So I closed my door, walked onto my porch and headed outside. But the person was still standing in front of my house. They began talking to me, and I'm going to use she here because it was a distinctly feminine voice. But like I said earlier, I have no idea who they were, not wearing my glasses and all. She asked me if I knew where Motor Road was. Now, I lived in this house for a few years, and lived in this town for almost 10 years, and I have never heard of this road. No, I'm sorry, I told her. Then she looked down the road back the way she'd come, then asked, well, do you know how I can find my way? I think I'm lost. It was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit where I live right now, and you don't want to be outside at night for very long. There's a gas station back that way, down on the corner. They may be able to help you, I said. She knew of the gas station and named it. Then she said, I can't go that way. I'm trying to get away from that direction. So I said, well, there are more gas stations in the opposite direction. It's just a little further. I proceeded to tell her to go down to the end of my street, take a right, keep going past William Street, and as soon as I mentioned William Street, she clasped her hands together and lit up. She interrupted me and said, are you sure? William Street is right there. Yes, I said. It's just the next one over. Oh my God, thank you so much. I'm trying to get to my safe place, she said. No problem, you're welcome, I replied, as she thanked me over and over. But that one line stuck out in my head. Her safe place. Before I could think about it any further or ask her about it, she took off running, like actually sprinting, as if zombies were chasing her like her life depended on it. She ran down my street the direction I had pointed her in, and she disappeared into the darkness. When I got inside after Pup had done his business, I sat and thought about what had just happened and couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I'd gotten. I reviewed what happened in my head over and over, and how she said she couldn't go that way, and how she needed to get to her safe place. She seemed so lost and scared, asking random strangers for help at night. Red flags went off everywhere, so I called the police non-emergency number and explained what had just happened. But I wasn't totally sure it warranted a 911 call, because no one was in immediate danger that I knew of. I just wanted someone to be aware that there was a person alone at night needing help for whatever reason. The officer on the other end of the call didn't seem convinced it was anything to be concerned about, though, until I told him about the safe place line. When I said that, there was a pause. Then he took all the necessary information and told me that they would be sending someone out to my area to make sure that she was all right if she needed help, and he thanked me for calling. So what happened here? Did I do a good deed? I hope she's all right. The thing that gets me the most, though, is the timing of it all. She'd crossed my driveway at the exact moment that I opened my door to go outside. She was walking fast, and a few seconds later she would have been beyond my house and down the street in the darkness. It's a quiet neighborhood, so I highly doubt she would have run into anyone else outside besides myself and my dog, and I just happened to come outside at that exact moment, It's just weird. Any thoughts? Shortly after moving into my first apartment, I started having strange encounters with one of my neighbours on laundry night. I would pass through my neighbour's carport when it rained to get to the laundromat, and I'd see him standing in the shadows. He'd startled me several times, but I assumed he was just avoiding the rain. I tried to be friendly, but he would just stare at me smoking his cigarette and not say a word. Soon it became a regular routine for him, and then the apartment across the way opened up and he moved into it. I changed laundry to a daytime-only event. As one night, I sat on my stoop on the phone and noticed a red light in the distance. It was him sitting in the dark with a video camera pointed straight at me. I immediately went inside to tell my friend who had been crashing at my place for a few weeks, and I freaked out. That night my friend went out, and when he was gone I could hear loud banging. It sounded far away, but I was using Sound Machine to help me sleep at the time, so I still couldn't be sure what it was. The next day as we left the apartment, we noticed the wood around the deadbolt on the door was all mushed up. I asked him if he'd noticed it when he'd come back, but it was late and he was a little drunk, so he wasn't sure. The maintenance people were very concerned about it though, because it looked like someone had tried to break in whilst I was home alone. Shortly after that, I left that place and got a new apartment, and luckily my new roommate had an amazing big dog, so when she was out of town one night, I woke up at around 3 a.m. to him growling at her window. I went over and ensured it was locked, and the next day my neighbours asked me if I'd locked myself out. No, why? I asked. And sure enough, the screen on the outside was all twisted, as if someone had tried to break in, but had gotten interrupted by a very big dog. The worst part was that I had out-of-state plates, and all my friends kept telling me to get them switched, because I was sticking out to the police. I often thought that he'd tracked me down by my plates and tried again, or maybe I was just paranoid, and this was a series of break-ins looking for money or jewellery, etc. So I would like to know how to better communicate with Abigor, aka Eligos, as I have already seen and talked with him. I would like to firstly explain to you how I met him. It was 3 years ago when I was 16. I was obsessed with knowing the truth about everything, the existence of good and evil, and I tried at first to talk with God, but he didn't answer. My background is Catholic, and my parents are pretty devout, but not closed-minded. So I wanted to see whatever demons or Satan would actually answer me, and that's exactly what I did. With the help of a friend who had the same interests as me, we searched for a demon that we felt attracted to. Then came the sigil, candles, salt, and everything else followed. The demon we found was called Abigor, and now I can't even remember why we chose him, but we did everything we read about, and I even put some drops of my own blood on there. Nothing happened, but the air was pretty cold and the flame of the candles started to waver a bit. Fast forward 2 years, and I was in a Catholic retreat with the same friend when he suddenly started to feel awful. He then threw up some dirt and almost fainted. He looked up at the priest in charge and told him the story I just told you. They called us up and told us to go see them, and when we got there, they put my friend onto a shrine they had that had a pretty creepy-looking book and also some oil. The priest then began to pray in Latin, and my friend started to shake, sweat, cry, but he calmed down once the priest had finished. He then suddenly stood up and ran into a corner, roaring louder than I've heard anything before, just like a lion. Then a shadow or some smoke appeared. One day in April 2020, I was at home on a strict 6-month quarantine, and I started to feel that something or someone was with me, but I couldn't figure out what. Every day at 1 a.m, my door and window was knocked on 3 times in a row, and I used to hear weird voices, and one night my door was open and it suddenly slammed shut very loudly, with my light going off, and all of this happened whilst I was on a video call with my ex-girlfriend. On other days, the living room couch was moved and rugs were turned upside down. It all stopped around 4 months later, but I started to feel lonely, so I tried meditating and praying to Abigor. It took almost a week until he answered me in my dreams, and at first I was pleased for him to be there. But then I asked him his intentions. He knew what I was trying to find out, so he just told me that he wouldn't hurt my cats, which is all I wanted to know. Then I asked about what he actually wanted, and he told me he just wanted to stay with me. Since then I've seen his horse around the house, and I've also heard him a couple of times. I haven't had the connection I once had, the one in my dreams, but only in real life being awake. I would like to make deals with him, or at least get to know him better, but I don't want to reject him like my friend did. So if I've made a mistake, or if I can get any advice, please let me know. Now, I've done quite well for myself as an adult, but when I was younger, we were very poor. In middle school, I lived in a government housing projects that were like little one-level apartments, with 2 apartments sharing a wall, all spaced apart. There were woods directly behind the cluster of apartments with no gate in between, but no one ever went in the woods, which I learned the reason for due to this incident. These apartments were very poorly made, and the windows could easily be popped in and out, so a lock was pointless. The front door was somewhat sturdy, but with a good kick, it would have easily been opened. My dad was a pretty stocky bodybuilder type, so I had a false sense of security and would leave my window blinds open at night, as my room faced some trees that would blow in the wind. I loved nature and wasn't afraid of the dark, so I liked watching the trees as I fell asleep. Our apartment front door was facing these woods, as was my friend's behind ours, with our building blocking their view. As you walk in the front door, the hallway is on the left, and my room was at the end of the hallway on the right. My big window that took up most of the wall was on the left, and my bed was sideways facing both walls, so I could lay on my side and watch the trees. The woods were about a field away facing our front door, so I couldn't see it from my room. This was just a small area of trees and vegetation. One night I woke up feeling a sense of unease, and through my sleepy haze made out the figure of a large man standing at my window, watching me sleep. This person had total confidence, not caring at all if he was seen, and he was in a big coat and looked quite burly, average in height. It was black in my room and outside, just barely illuminated by moonlight, and I had just cracked open my eyes. I froze once I'd realized what I was seeing, and kept my eyes closed as tightly as possible, just enough to peer at him in the darkness. I then literally rolled out of my bed to the side, not facing the window, and shouted for my dad, who was across the hall with both of our doors open, as I crawled out. It wasn't the smartest thing I did, but I was a dumb 12-year-old. He hadn't gone to sleep yet, and was in my room in a heartbeat as the guy took off. My dad went to run out the front door yelling threats, which probably wasn't smart, but the guy was gone. I truly believe he'd never come in before or after this, just due to my dad's sheer size and build, but I'll never know. A few nights later, I was spending the night with my friends who lived directly behind us with the same layout. Her room was the first room on the left with her window facing the woods, with our apartment building blocking the view. Her sister's room was the second on the left, and her mum and her toddler sister were in the room on the right, like mine in our own apartment. We'd finished watching Dave Chappelle and went to do one another's hair in her room, with her older sister helping us whilst her mum and little sister went to bed. Not long after, we heard screaming from her mum's room and heavy stomping footsteps. Her older sister swung open the door to the room we were in, and a flash of a huge man in his 30s to 40s was running down the hall towards the living room and front door, with her mum behind him, carrying a butcher's knife, hacking at the air and screaming bloody murder. The dude flew out the door and towards the woods, while her mum locked the door and called the cops. This man had had the audacity to pop open the window and crawl into the bed that was pushed against it and slightly under it, not realizing this woman was a whole Amazon warrior who slept with a butcher's knife and would clearly wake up to protect her babies. She was quick and had slashed at him, though I'm not sure of the damage since I was ushered home directly after. The cops went looking in the woods for him and found him and another man living and hiding out there together. They were also responding to a call from a frantic mother whose little girl had been taken that day as well from our housing units, and they found her with those creeps. The child had been there all day and night with them and was around 3 to 4. They were arrested and taken to jail, and that's the last I'd heard of it, as the adults didn't let us in on their conversation. Poor little girl was probably traumatized, and I hope she's been able to heal. I can't imagine what could have happened if my friend's mum hadn't been so quick and slept with a weapon, or if he had decided to fight instead of run. I still don't understand why he didn't try to overpower her, but it's possible she injured him. After this, my dad explained to me how sometimes drug addicts or homeless people would hang out in these woods. So this happened my freshman year of high school, and I took a semester of gym just to get it over with. But at the time, I had really bad and undiagnosed asthma, so I was always behind the class. Every other Wednesday, my class would run around the lake right near the high school, and the rule was that we had to be in pairs, while the gym teacher ran ahead of everyone. For what reason, I don't know. We were all very clearly high schoolers, as we were wearing gym uniforms, and I was pretty much always in the back with one girl who didn't care about gym at all, so she didn't mind running with me and my bad lungs. However, while we were running, I got a sinking feeling and glanced behind me. 2 guys were trailing us, and they instantly stood out. While everyone was wearing swimsuits or short skirts, one of these guys was wearing a very formal outfit with a tie, and the other had a full cowboy getup on. Both of them had sunglasses that covered the majority of their face, and they were slowly getting closer and closer, following us for a while. I told my friend that we needed to catch up with the rest of the group, when she noticed the guys behind us and nodded in agreement. Just as they were close enough to grab us, though, we bolted ahead as fast as we could and caught up to the other girls. When we turned around, the guys stopped dead in their tracks and stared at us for a while, before turning around and walking in the other direction. We told everyone about what had just happened, and they said that those guys had been staring at them as they passed by too. They just thought they were being creepy and staring at underage girls. We finally made it around the lake, and the gym teacher had been there for a while. She didn't believe us when we told her about the guys, so we just didn't say anything else about it after that. About 8 years ago, 2 buddies and I decided to spend the night camping at Palo Duro Canyon. We're from Amarillo, Texas, so it's less than 20 miles away, and it's the 2nd largest canyon in the US next to the Grand Canyon. You may be wondering what kind of spooky stuff we may have run into as young kids of just 17 years of age, but this isn't necessarily that kind of story. Instead, us 3 friends were some of the only around our age that we knew that didn't indulge in partying. No drinking, getting stoned, nothing of that nature. So of course we thought a perfect getaway on a Friday night would be the canyon. We didn't even own camping supplies. We just went to Walmart and bought some, and headed out on a whim. So we made the drive out there to the state park around 5 p.m. and entered the gate, setting off to find a spot to pitch a few tents. We pulled into this campsite area that had 2 separate canopies, with picnic tables, respective grills for cooking, and in the middle of both canopies was a fire pit. Nobody was there, so we thought it was the perfect place to set up. We'd brought some coolers with soda, some hot dogs and hamburgers to grill, and a stereo to jam some tunes, whilst we hung out and enjoyed the last few hours of daylight in the Texas summer heat. After we pitched our tents, a truck with a small camper RV moseyed on into the site. A man and a woman got out and surveyed the area, and the man saw us and waved with that friendly Texan hospitality. We waved back, of course, then went on about our business. We ate dinner and the sun was starting to set, when I noticed that the man and woman hadn't pitched a tent, so they'd probably just intended on staying in their camper. We built a fire and sat around it in some portable chairs we'd brought with us, and I saw the man walking towards us. He introduced himself as Doug, and said that he'd cooked a lot of extra food if we wanted any. We politely declined and told him we had already eaten, but we appreciated the offer, and he said, "Hey, as long as you guys have eaten, it's no big deal." He waved again, then set back off to his camp. About an hour later he came back with a brown paper bag and commented on the music we were listening to, saying that how back in the 70s he'd gone to all these festivals and basically just rambled on how it was awesome we were so young and still keeping classic rock alive. He also noticed that my friends had guitars and actually yelled over to his wife to come over. By this point we didn't think anything weird of it. We just didn't know him or his wife, and he'd obviously been drinking, and they just invited themselves over into our space. None of us had the spine to say anything to him about it, so we all just sat around the fire trading stories, as much as 3 17-year-old boys could with a couple probably in their late 50s, early 60s. After what seemed like a lifetime of bullshitting stories with these people we didn't know, Doug started to try to get to know us on a more personal level. He was super polite, but obviously a little drunk. He asked us if we had jobs or if we were in school, and we all replied to the question. He said that he worked at a United supermarket as a stocker and had done so for the last 15 years, telling us basically that if any of us needed a job at any time, that we were to put him as a reference and he could get us on. Then he told us his full name for us to reference, just in case any one of us wanted to apply. And this is important for later. Finally the wife began to nod off, all liquored and bundled up and asleep in the chair. Luckily that was the cue for Doug to get her back to the camp and put her to bed. When they walked off back to their site, the three of us looked at each other and eye-rolled, because we were all such doormats and basically let this stranger come and ruin our night. Seeing it was close to midnight then, we decided to put out the fire and get ready for bed. But Doug trotted back over to our site and asked us if we were there all weekend or not. We told him we only had enough money to stay for one night, and that we'd be heading back to town in the morning. He said he'd really enjoyed the company, and that he'd personally pay for us to stay another night if we wanted to. We politely declined his offer, and he started back off to his RV, but then he quickly turned back around and said, "Remember guys, if any of you need a job, just call up to United on Gem Lake Road and tell them Doug sent you." We smiled and said thanks, and he left for good that time. That night actually got considerably cold, and we decided to pack up and head to our warm beds in town at around 4 a.m. As we were leaving the canyon though, we almost hit a deer and veered off the road. Everyone was okay, but we were definitely shaken up, because it was so late and we had gotten no sleep by that point. Us almost hitting the deer was practically the climax of our trip to the canyon that weekend, and we all continued back to school on Monday as normal. One of my friends that was part of the group on the camping trip was actually in my 3rd period class on Monday, and we started talking about how that guy Doug and his wife were pretty cool, despite not taking the hint that we didn't care to hang out with them. I asked my buddy if he could remember Doug's last name, and somehow he did, so I googled him. Big mistake. Guess who was a 10 times over registered sex offender, who almost all of his victims were boys from ages 12 to 17? You guessed it, Doug. This completely rocked our world. We had somehow, some way, just barely escaped the clutches of this paedophile. What would have happened to us if we took his offer to stay another night? I was so suspicious of this dude and couldn't get the scenario off my mind that I decided to call United Supermarket to tell the manager that one of his employees was being really creepy to us kids and that he might want to be wary of the people he hires. And guess what? Nobody by Doug's name had ever worked for United. He'd been bullshitting us all night long, trying to get us drunk, to do God knows what to us innocent kids. Be careful who you talk to, guys. I'm a 28-year-old man, and the following happened a couple of years back when the city of the apartment that I'm currently renting with my brother was much more gang-ridden. Fortunately, a lot of those kinds of people had moved out at the end of last year, so things are safe now. However, at the time, where I lived was rather dangerous, and the following story shows that. It was February 2020, and the rent was due by the 5th. So before the deadline, my brother and I went and withdrew the money. Then shortly after we came home, I left my apartment, went down to the rental office to pay, and got the receipt, etc. As I was leaving and heading back to my apartment, though, is where the encounter all began. I looked across the street and saw a tall, skinny man with his pants somewhat hanging below his waist. He was walking up ahead, and I merely glanced at him. But as soon as the guy had noticed me, he started screaming at me viciously. But as I continued walking back to my apartment, he started screaming profanities and more. Then he started to cross the street to where I was going. But because he was ahead of me and on the opposite street, he decided to cross, instead of heading directly towards me. So he crossed the street and sat on some apartment steps up ahead to where I was going, and I'm guessing this was so that I would have to cross his path on my way to get to the front of my apartment. He was dead silent, but you could tell that he could lash out at any second, which gave me chills. My heart was pounding in my chest, and thoughts started running through my head. What if he had a weapon? What if he was going to try and jump me when I passed by? Would he follow me back into my apartment? With my thoughts racing, I quickly remembered the back entrance. So I went around to the back of the apartment and got into the building there. Once home, I told my brother what had happened, and we immediately agreed that the police should be called. So that's what we did, and it took about 7 minutes for them to get there. Whilst waiting for the police to arrive, I looked out the window of my top floor, and there the guy was. He was walking about the area with a suspicious look on his face, quickly looking back every now and then to see if someone was watching him. Eventually the police arrived. I told them what happened and gave them a description of the guy, etc. The police also agreed to do a quick sweep of the area, but the man was nowhere to be found, though they said they would keep an eye out. Who was that man? He may have been on drugs, which caused him to become very paranoid, but who knows? As for me, all I know is, if my apartment hadn't have had a back entrance, things could have ended badly. This story took place this last summer in August, when I went to visit my friend in another city. I had been there for one day, and that night we decided to go out for some drinks and dinner. But as we were walking to the restaurant, dressed to the nines, a couple of older men stopped us and asked what we were doing that night. We chatted, and they asked if we would be willing to come for a drink with them after. My friend and I, being young and liking the attention of course, said we would see how we feel, and then said they would be staying at the restaurant that we saw them outside of, and that their usual table was right next to the patio entrance. So we went for our dinner, and as we were walking back, not giving these men another thought, we heard them calling over, and they said to just join them for a drink. My friend and I kind of looked at each other, and it was only about midnight, So we decided we would go and join them. Now my friend is hilarious, and we're both relatively assertive, so she decided to ask for 2 triples and a shot of an expensive tequila when they asked what we wanted to drink. They laughed and said how they liked that she knew what she wanted, and the drinks came out pretty quickly. But the shots were taking a while, and one of the gentlemen had gotten up and left the table, we assumed to take a call. After a few minutes, the gentleman came back to the table and sat down next to my friend, and the shots came out not long after with the waitress. Not thinking anything of this, my friend and I took our shots, and almost 5 minutes later, my friend looked at me and said that something was wrong, and she didn't feel right. My friend in general tends to overreact, sometimes, so I brushed it off and assumed everything was okay. Now the next part of the story isn't coming from my own recollection, as unfortunately I don't remember anything from the night. My friend said that I'd begun slurring my words and acting a lot more drunk than I should have been, given the amount that I had drunk, and one of the gentlemen suggested that they give us a ride home, because I wasn't looking so well. My friend asked if they had a car, because in this big city it's not common to drive around, it's more common to taxi or Uber, and they had pointed to a Rolls Royce that had legally tinted windows and was running with a driver in the front about 5 feet away from the patio that we were sitting on, which had been there for about 30 minutes. My friend immediately got a weird feeling and thought she was also kind of loopy and dizzy, and she got us both out of there as fast as she could. She said she'd provided no explanation, then grabbed me by the arm and started dragging me down the street into a highly populated downtown area whilst booking an Uber. According to my friend, the entirety of the Uber ride I was sweating profusely and vomiting. I could barely walk, speak, my eyes were rolled back and I was completely incoherent. When asking my friend about how I'd gotten so sick and she hadn't, she reminded me that she had been drinking a lot the night before and wasn't feeling that great, so she only took about 1/3 of the shot because she wasn't able to finish it. Me, on the other hand, of course, I took the entirety of the shot down and clearly got a higher dose of whatever was given. The next day, of course, I felt like absolute garbage. But needless to say, I think my friend definitely saved both of us, if not just me, that night, from an unknown group of men who had unknown intentions with 2 young, drunk and drugged up girls in the heart of a big city. It's true that I lived a very sheltered life. My grandma never really trusted me to do anything on my own and could barely stand to allow me access to the outside world. She controlled my use on the internet, never allowed me to have a phone, and always tried to force me to come home straight after school, and I couldn't watch the news or read a newspaper. So it's safe to say that when I turned 18, I became a little reckless. I found sneaky ways to get around her no free internet time, by going over to friends' houses and using their phones. And that's how I met Matt. Matt was a 27-year-old man, and needless to say, I started to develop feelings for him, and I thought he was feeling the same. Now, though, I see that I was wrong. Matt and I planned to meet up. He knew from stories how controlling my grandmother was, and wanted to help me experience all that life has to offer, so I agreed. At the time I was working as a janitor and had a steady income, and one of the things I asked Matt to do was to buy me alcohol with my money, and he happily agreed and told me to meet him 2 cities over. I did so, and the first thing we did when meeting up was go buy the alcohol. He brought me back to his place and introduced me to his friends, Tyler and Sarah, who are married. So the 4 of us began drinking, and it didn't take long for Tyler and Matt to get smashed, but I was taking it slow due to it being my first time, though that didn't stop Matt from trying to force more alcohol down my throat. When it got close to being dark, Matt and Tyler had gotten into a fight, and to this day I can't ever remember why they were fighting. It had gotten so bad, though, that Tyler started to beat the crap out of Matt. I had never seen 2 people actually fist fight before, and was unsure how to stop it. Sarah and I just kept yelling at them to stop, and eventually the fight made its way outside, and Taylor had Matt lying in the grass, while he just punched him over and over. Suddenly Matt's grandfather showed up, as he lived down the road, and yelled at Tyler, telling him he had called the cops. Tyler at that point stopped punching Matt and walked over to Matt's grandfather, demanding his car keys from him. Matt's grandfather refused, and Tyler forced the keys out of his hands. Then he ran over to the truck and got in just as the cops showed up. Tyler freaked out and floored it out of the driveway, but the cops blocked his way, and Tyler decided to drive up onto a driveway across the street, slamming full force into a boat that the neighbor was working on. Thankfully, the neighbor was quick enough to get out of the way. The cops pulled Tyler out of the car and arrested him, and Matt went to the hospital, whilst his grandfather looked after me, asking me to stay until Matt got back from the hospital. I agreed, wanting to make sure that Matt was okay. It had gotten dark by the time he got back, and told me that I was just going to stay the night. I tried to present, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, and that should have been a red flag for me. So I ended up spending the night on his couch. The next day Matt took me to the bus station and sent me home, and I thought I would never see Matt again, until one day he contacted me. It was through email, as I had no phone, and he was inviting me to a party. I was excited to go and said yes, so he asked for my address and I gave it. Later on that night he came and picked me up, and the first thing he asked was if I could help by giving him money for alcohol. I agreed and gave him some money, and we went and picked up some drinks. We then started to drive to where the party was, and I kept trying to ask him where we were going, because he seemed to have kept driving further and further away from the city. But he just kept saying, "It's a surprise, don't worry, baby. I'll take good care of you." Then he grabbed my knee and roughly squeezed in. Red flag number 2. He kept driving and the houses kept getting more and more spread out. "Why are we going so far out?" I asked. "We're going to a friend's place. Don't worry, they throw parties all the time," was what he told me. We had finally made it to the house, and I was now really nervous, because it was the only house for miles around. We got out of the car and made our way in then. When I entered, I saw that Sarah was there, Tyler's wife, and also Tyler was there. I gave him a look and he said, "Don't worry, girlie, we made amends." I then looked around and there was no one else there. "Where are the owners of the house?" I asked. "Well, they aren't actually here, but they said we could throw a party. They're out of town for the week," Matt said, shoving a strong drink into my hand. Red flag number 3. Feeling very uncomfortable, I said, "I don't really feel like this is the right thing to do." Matt only laughed and told me to start drinking, and said, "That feeling will go away when you're buzzed." When I hesitated, he walked up to me and put his cup to my lips and forced me to take a drink. I coughed at how strong the drink was, and everyone laughed and began drinking and dancing. Matt and Tyler quickly had gotten drunk, and I'm sure that Sarah was high on something, because she quickly passed out on the floor. Later on in the night, I asked Matt if I could go home, and he said, "Tomorrow, baby. We're having fun tonight, come on." He grabbed my hand and pulled me into one of the rooms. "We can sleep in here for the night," Matt said, and Tyler walked in just then and said, "Lame. Are you two going to sleep right now?" Matt only laughed and said, "Dude, get out of here. You're cock-blocking me." They both laughed and Matt tossed me onto the bed. "Matt, please, I don't feel comfortable here. I want to go home," I begged. Matt got mad at that point and said, "You're staying here for the night. If you don't behave yourself, I will let Tyler here use you for his own enjoyment." When I started to shake, Tyler leaned over and said, "Chill out, girlie, he's only joking." But then Matt chimed in. "Was I?" And they both started to laugh. After a few hours of them talking, Tyler left the room and Matt laid down. "Good night, baby," he slurred and passed out. I got off the bed and walked to the bathroom, splashed some water on my face and tried to breathe. When I finally calmed down, I walked back into the room and laid down on the floor and fell asleep quickly. The next morning I got up and walked into the kitchen, and everyone was there. Matt walked up, handing me some orange juice, and I took a sip and gagged. "Is there alcohol in this?" I asked. Everyone laughed, and Sarah said, "It's called a screwdriver." I set the cup down, saying, "It's early. I don't want to drink." They all frowned, and Matt said, "I've been drinking since I got up." "You told me you would take me home today," I said, frowning. Matt waved his hand at me and said, "Tomorrow, babe." The three of them then spent the rest of the day drinking and sleeping, and every once in a while Matt would force me to chug a drink. "You gotta catch up with us, baby. Come on, life is so much better this way." He would say this often, but I just kept asking him to take me home. He would just blow me off, though, and that night he was so drunk that he forced me to do things I wasn't comfortable with, and in the middle of it all he passed out, so I pushed him off me and crawled to the ground, crying myself to sleep. Days 3, 4, 5, and 6 were all the same, with him saying, "Tomorrow, babe," and forcing a drink down my throat. Finally, on day 7, the owners of the house came home, and they didn't seem worried that there were people there partying. But at least when I asked them to take me home, they were more than happy to, though Matt threw a fit and told them I was only joking. I had to wait until Matt had drunk himself to sleep to ask again to be taken home. I actually begged them and told them I wasn't happy there and how long I had been there. They seemed surprised and quickly got me out of the house and dropped me off in the city. I took the bus home and locked myself in my room for an entire week and never told anyone what had happened for the fear that Matt would hurt me, or the fear that no one in my life would even believe me. To this day, at the age of 27, I still can't deal with driving in rural areas in any state. Sure, I could have just walked away from the house at any point, but when I was taken out to the house it was pitch black, and I had no idea where I was. I had tried to use Matt's phone to call someone to come pick me up, but his phone was locked. I thought about calling the cops too, but I didn't know the address, and was scared that the cops would put me in jail for drinking underage, and I didn't want my life to be ruined over this. I was also scared that if Matt had woken up and seen me holding his phone, he would have hurt me. I was scared the whole time and always had alcohol in my system, so my thoughts weren't always clear. Plus I was also sleep deprived as I was sleeping on the floor for days on end, and if I tried to sleep any time they were awake, they'd just wake me back up. They were all so creepy and refused to ever listen to me. But thankfully though, I was able to get out, and I never saw them again. From that point on, I was careful to trust people so easily. So my brother's partner and best friend and I all recently took a trip to Kansas City to go to the Orville Peck concert. We waited until sort of last minute to reserve an Airbnb, because we weren't 100% sure of all who was going. Nonetheless, we found one just outside of the city in a suburb called Grandview, and they were being sold at a pretty reasonable rate. The host's overall rating was good, and we didn't see anything out of the ordinary when reading the first few reviews, so we thought we had gotten a pretty good deal. We arrived in Grandview a little after 3 p.m, and our Airbnb was the bottom floor of the owner's home. As we pulled up to the house, we noticed quite a few signs of religion and statues on the lawn. And don't get me wrong, I don't have an issue with people believing in what they believe in, so long as it doesn't infringe upon other people's rights. But here we were, a group of very visibly queer folks about to attend a gay country concert, and we were blindly walking into someone's home that we'd be staying in for the next 2 nights. We decided there was nothing to be worried about though, and that after all, we technically were in the Bible Belt, so we shouldn't be surprised that we were staying in the home of someone who was religious. My brother and partner called the host up and met her at the door of our guest suite. She showed them around. Then whilst the rest of us got our suitcases unloaded, they came back to meet us, and they said she was super nice. So again our minds were eased. We then decided to hang out, order food, and rest a little before we headed off to the concert that night. However, our comfort didn't last very long. While we were getting our suitcases unpacked and laying around in one of the bedrooms of our guest suite, my youngest brother was casually looking through the drawers of the dressers and side tables, as anyone would do, and most of what he found was normal. Extra bed sheets, pens, paper tablets, nothing really out of the ordinary. That is until he came across something that would completely change our outlook on the trip. Inside the drawer was a Bible, which of course wasn't that weird, considering where we were staying, but as he was flipping through the pages of it, a small tinfoil packet fell out. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about drugs or what they look like, what fell out of that Bible rhymes with smack star Serowin. That's right. Not even 30 minutes into our stay, my youngest brother found hard drugs in the folds of a Bible. At this point, we weren't sure what to do. We didn't want to tell the hosts, and we most certainly didn't want to tell the cops. We contemplated taking the packet and throwing it away at some random gas station, but ultimately we decided to put it back where we found it and act like none of us had seen it. Later on, we got food and started getting ready for the concert, whilst the rest of us got ready. My partner, who was not going to the concert, started reading through the household handbook, and everything seemed pretty standard, except a few lines that read something like, "We will respect your privacy so long as you respect ours. We can be as available as you want us to be, and if you are interested in speaking about the ministries of God, feel free to reach out." Again, I have nothing against people following the religions that they do, but that seemed like an awfully out-of-place thing to put in your house rules handbook for your guest suite. There were a few other books around that stuck out as a little off base, with titles such as Teaching Men to Comprehend How Women Think and How Women Should Think. We ignored these things for the most part, aside from my partner, who was now freaked out about being left alone. So I told him it was just some Bible-thumping crap, and that he really didn't have anything to worry about. He's a worrywart, though, so as soon as we left, he locked himself in the bedroom and started looking a little more into the books that we'd found. Doing so, he came to the realization that the books were associated with a group called IHOPKC, or International House of Prayer, which is a prominent religious cult found in Kansas City, a majority of whose members live in the Grandview suburb where we were staying. I could write a whole separate post about the beliefs of IHOPKC members, but essentially they're an evangelical Christian group that has a functioning 24/7 prayer room that's been going non-stop since 1999. There is also a murder, ruled suicide, cover-up case associated with the group. But again, it's all too much to go over here. We got back from the concert really late, not to mention a couple of us were still heavily intoxicated, so he didn't mention much about it that night, but he was certainly quick to tell us the next morning. At this point we thought, okay, these people are a part of some weird church. Whatever, it's fine. It explains some of the weird rules and books we'd found anyway. That day we left to go hang out around the city, and when we got back for a rest, my friend and partner started doing some more reading on the group, and that's when they found out that we were actually staying in one of the prominent leaders' houses. We figured this out by cross-referencing the names of our hosts with the names of the important members on the IHOPU, International House of Prayer University website. After that, we started to snoop further in our suite and found large barrels of dry food, a jug of some liquid that we later found out was what they drank while they fasted, and lots more IHOPKC teaching materials. Basically, it seemed like they were completely prepared for some sort of end-of-times rapture. Once we were back, we read more thoroughly through the reviews and found a few that would have set off some red flags had we paid more attention. For example, one review stated how the male owner brought out a gun in front of the people who were staying there. Yikes. Not to mention that if there was even a hint of a negative review left, the host would leave a snarky reply. Needless to say, we spent as much of our time as possible away from the Airbnb as we could for the remainder of our trip, and although we were never in any direct danger, we did feel very uncomfortable with the whole thing. This happened about 3 years ago when I was out walking my dog, and has always just bugged me as a bit weird. To make the story easier, I'm going to briefly describe my dog and where we live. He was a Staffy Bull Cross, and we rescued him from a dog shelter when he was about 8. By this time he'd already had pretty bad arthritis in his back hips and was on daily medication for it. He also suffered from really bad anxiety caused by being abandoned by his previous owners and being in the dog shelter for such a long period of time. He was terrified of cats, and other dogs made him nervous, and if he saw another dog he'd freeze, put his tail between his legs, would become silent and just stare. If the dog came over he'd be ready to fight. But one time I was walking him in the evening, and 4 cats came out of nowhere and were hissing at him and chasing him, almost like they could smell his fear. But with people he is the biggest sweetheart. My son was 3 when we got him, and that little lad could do no wrong in the dog's eyes. If my son was lying in his bed, he'd lie on the floor next to him. If my boy wanted to wrestle, the dog let it happen. If my son wanted a cuddle, the dog would lie there for an hour. And if we had a burglar broke in, my dog would just be happy to meet a new friend. He loved food, cuddles, and lying in the sun on the grass, and we miss him every day now he's gone. We live in a new-built housing estate on the edge of a town in the UK, and the site is basically one big circle with one main road going right through the middle. Off this main road is a load of side streets. Some are dead ends and some loop back around to the main road, or they connect to other roads, and there's a few grassy patches for kids and dogs and a load of footpaths and cycle paths. So with all that said, on to the night in question. We went out for a last walk about 9 p.m. before bedtime, and it was early spring, so it was dark and cold. My street is a dead end, but connects up with other roads via some footpaths, so we started walking down some of the footpaths, going roughly parallel with the main road. We hadn't made it to any of the grassy areas yet, so it was just parked cars and houses around us. About 5 minutes into the walk, we reached a crossroads, and roughly speaking, turning left, we would be headed towards the main road, and right would take you further away. My dog just then went still and quiet, and his tail went between his legs. He was scared. I began to look for cats hiding in the dark, and I tried to get him to move, but he wouldn't. I couldn't see a thing. Then suddenly a dog, off leash with no owner in sight, came trotting up from the right-hand turn. It was a golden retriever. Nothing unusual about it, except to see it was clean. Its coat was clearly white gold, and it wasn't muddy or wet or anything. It came closer and was now right near us, still with no owner in sight. My dog doesn't like other dogs, and this one is off leash with no one around, and I wanted to get away before it kicked off. So I got out a treat from my pocket to try and get his attention, but my dog just ignored it. I got out 2 more treats, and he eventually reluctantly started to walk to get them. We then took a left and back towards the main road, and I was trying to walk quickly to stay ahead, but he kept stopping to look back. The golden retriever was following us, still trotting at the same pace about 20 meters behind us. Once we'd reached the end of the road, which was a T-junction, we took the left and were now around the corner, so I had a little jog, thinking maybe we could get far enough away that the golden retriever would go elsewhere. But no. It came around the corner and kept following. My dog really wanted to stop, but I kept dragging him after me, and at the end of the street I turned left. Now it was about 200 meters back to our house, and pretty much a straight line. The dog reached the main road, and here it finally stopped following us. Where we turned left, it turned right, and trotted across the main road and went to the other side, where there was a guy stood, waiting. He was just stood there on the pavement, doing nothing. The dog stopped next to him, and they both just stared at us as we walked away as quickly as we could. They were still watching up until the point where we'd gotten far enough away that you couldn't see them anymore, and that's it. Nothing bad happened, and we never saw that man or dog again. It was just weird how the dog was so far away, probably 400 meters as the crow flies, but even further down the bends and curves and corners of the road. The man and the dog were basically in completely opposite parts of the estate. The dog had probably escaped out of an open door, and the man was out looking for him, but he wasn't shouting out or even running around. He was, to my eye, literally just waiting. What do you think? Just a lost dog and an owner out looking, or something else? Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.